Very much, Mr. Wilshire, and good afternoon to you. I'm grateful for the chance to raise an issue which has been something of a perennial for me in the 12 years that I've been a Member of Parliament, although it's particularly timely in my area at the moment, following a local development on bus services that I'll describe to the Minister. But I wanted to flag up to him a question that I'd be grateful for his response to, and if I flag it up at the start, it may give him the opportunity to seek inspiration, as it were, as I progress, which is the whole issue of whether bus companies can subsidise less profitable routes by more profitable routes. As will become apparent as I speak, the local company First Bus have withdrawn a particular service on the grounds they weren't making enough money. And when my constituents wrote to them and said, well, why don't you subsidise this service from one of your city centre routes on which you make a lot of money, First Bus replied, and I quote, "We are not able to cross-subsidise routes. The Transport Act does not allow busy city routes to subsidise less used routes." And it would be helpful when the Minister responds if he could comment on that comment by the bus company as to whether their understanding of the law in this regard is correct or not, because I think it might be slightly more subtle than they are describing. But to step back, Mr. Wilshire, the context of this is I represent a part of South Gloucestershire where there are a lot of small towns and villages where there's very heavy car usage and bus services are, on the whole, pretty poor. If you happen to live on one of the main arterial routes into the centre of Bristol, you stand the best chance of getting a bus service. But if you live in a village, if you need to travel in the evening, if you need to travel on a Sunday, if you need to travel out of hours to get to a hospital appointment or something, you've got serious problems. But one of the services was an express service, an X service down the M32 motorway, the X27, which went from Yate in my constituency, past a village called Iron Acton, through Winterbourne and into the city centre, and was a popular local route. We'd had a set of bus changes announced by First not many months ago. They'd originally proposed to withdraw their fast bus services down the motorway. And we all thought this was ludicrous, that, you know, there's been talk of bus lanes and special measures of getting buses into the city centre quickly, and here was the bus company planning to take off some of its express routes down the motorway. And we fought a campaign, and there was an extensive period of public consultation, and to be fair to First, they did revise their plans in the light of that consultation and that campaign, and we were able to keep some of the express motorway services going. Given all of that experience, not many months ago, we were all horrified to get a letter in March telling us that in 8 weeks' time, First would stop running the X27 service. No consultation, minimum warning. The local authority found out about it pretty much the same time that the rest of us did. And the bus company just said, things have turned down, we're not making the money we want to on this route, we're pulling out. And an awful lot of people were very unhappy about this. I have to say that this company does not have the best local reputation. We ran an online petition and lots of my constituents made comments. First buses are truly the worst buses. Shame on you, Justin Davis, who's the Managing Director, and your company. You've returned us to the dark ages when only those who can drive have the freedom to get around and live their lives, and so on. The Bristol Evening Post can regularly get a front page story from the latest outrage that First Bus have perpetrated on the benighted residents of Bristol and South Gloucestershire. So there's a history here of poor service, a lot of things that people are unhappy about. But this was, as it were, this was even taking their performance to a new level by simply announcing with the minimum possible notice that this route would be taken away. And this impacted on a whole range of people. And in the context of thinking about social exclusion, some of the comments from my constituents I think are particularly germane. One lady wrote this: "Please do not cut the X27. I will be totally unable to get an alternative bus as I am 84. And this is the only bus that goes from outside where I live. I will be unable to go anywhere, which is very depressing." So the elderly, very heavily dependent on this service, were disappointed. Somebody said, "Just got my bus pass, but there's now no bus." So obviously older people were particularly affected by all of this. But it wasn't just the elderly, young people very much affected. We had one young student who responded to a survey we did via Facebook, a young woman who said, "I'm doing my A-levels, and you're going to cut the bus on the 10th of May. How do you expect me to get to my exams?" And nobody had thought about that. It was just, we're not making money, we're pulling the plug in 8 weeks' time. And one of my worries about the structure, Mr. Wilshire, of the bus services that we have is it's fine to say, well, they're just in it to make money, they make money and we subsidise the rest. But unless you have this kind of long-term stability and planning, how is one ever going to get long-term growth in bus usage if people know that the service can be cut with 8 weeks' notice? People plan their jobs, they plan their studies, they plan their lives around transport arrangements, and if bus companies can just pull the plug at 8 weeks' notice, that is not going to give anybody confidence to plan their lives around public transport. Yet another person will assume the only thing they can do is use the car. And this young woman, in fact, if we hadn't been able to do something about the X27, had said she would have to move out of her home for the period of her exams because there was no other way she could actually get to her studies. Likewise, on students, another woman put, my daughter is in the final year of her A-levels, she works long hours in the library, getting into college quickly makes her long day more bearable. And then she talks, interestingly, about the quality of service the bus company have offered, and the mother writes this: over 2 years of poor timekeeping, often rude and aggressive drivers, and overcrowding on the X27, a company with a poor name for service should be doing its utmost to improve customer relations, not anger its client group of travellers. So a whole saga, really, of poor quality of service, unpredictability, and now pulling the rug at the last minute. So we launched a campaign, Mr Wiltshire, campaign to get South Gloucestershire Council to subsidise the route. And that's what's happened after a successful campaign. But the council's done what? It's agreed to step in to provide money for a reduced service once an hour, and will do so for 6 months. And then, of course, in 6 months' time, we shall have the whole thing again. People won't know where they stand. They won't know whether they can rely on the service beyond the 6-month period. And whilst the council, and I welcome this, is going to do what First should have been doing anyway, which is promote the service, because very often you can stand at a bus stop along the route and not even find timetable information. And indeed, when First announced that they were planning to scrap the service or stop it going at various stops, they didn't even put information on the bus stops. That's the contempt with which they treat their passengers, because they are a monopoly. Yes, in theory, Steve Webb buses could set up and run along the same route, but we all know that First are going to be the ones. And of course, the irony is, First won the tender for the subsidised service, so they end up still running the service anyway, but being paid by the council to do it. I can't help feeling that where we've got with buses in the last 20 years is the worst of all worlds, because in many places we don't have a public monopoly, which at least could be in the public interest, or vigorous private competition, which might be efficient. We end up with a private monopoly, and I think that's probably the worst of all worlds. So, stepping back from that local example, and as I say, we've temporarily, we have a sticking plaster solution. Local council taxpayers are now paying to keep the service going once an hour for the next 6 months, but no long-term solution. And my question really, therefore, for the Minister is, what is the long-term prospect for my constituents, not just on this route, but across the area, of a decent quality bus service? Now, the context the Minister will be very familiar with is that since deregulation, areas, more sort of built-up areas like Bristol and the surrounds, have suffered big time since deregulation. 94% rise in real value of fares, 46% fall in patronage. So huge hikes in fares, drop in bus usage in those sorts of areas, very much contrasted with London. And I know the Minister will be familiar, but it's worth putting on the record that in London, where the local authority can essentially dictate the services, the fares, the routes, and can coordinate, bus usage is growing at its fastest rate since the mid-1940s. Buses in London carry the highest number of passengers since 1968, and bus mileage in London is higher than at any time since 1957. Now, London is different. I accept London is different, but there's a lot of features of the London model that, in my view, could be applied. Now, what has the government done about this? Well, we've had the Local Transport Act 2008, and perhaps that will be the Minister's response, that this is the way forward. And if you look at what that Local Transport Act does, it allows, first of all, more flexible voluntary deals between bus companies and councils, but in our area, First have got the councils over a barrel, frankly. They're the only providers. And I was rather alarmed to discover that in the passenger transport executive areas, 90% of the services are run by the big 5 operators, and in general, they don't fight each other. It's almost, it feels like a stitch-up. First run in Bristol. So, do Arriva and all the others compete against First? Well, mysteriously, it doesn't seem to happen. So the theory of competition is great, but the reality is we all know that the vast bulk of the services will be run by First. Wessex Connect will pick up the odd one, South Gloucestershire Bus and Coach will pick up the odd one, but we all know that First are going to be in there, they're going to be the main providers. So we don't get realistic competition. So if the councils and the bus company have the councils over a barrel on voluntary partnerships? What about statutory partnerships? Well, that's another option, although these are quite limited in scope. And then there's what, in fact, is my preferred model in a case such as this, which is the kind of franchising model, or what's known in the jargon as a quality contract. Now, the Local Transport Act provides for that, so I think that's potentially welcome. But my understanding is all the Act was passed last year, the regulations and guidance aren't in force yet, and I hope the Minister will tell us when they will be. And although in theory it's been possible for some years for a local authority to franchise services across an area, in reality nobody has applied for or been granted permission to do this, because in the past certainly the legislative hurdle for being allowed to franchise across the area has been very high. I welcome the fact that the Local Transport Act relaxes that, but I still worry and am concerned that even when all of this is in place, will we really see the Greater Bristol area franchising, having fierce competition between the companies? Actually, aren't there still an awful lot of tests that have to be overcome? And my view would be that the decades of failure of public transport in our area ought of itself to be enough evidence, really, that the alternatives have been tried. They've been tried vigorously. Yes, we're going to get what they call, I think they're called in the latest jargon, quality corridors or something like that. So, yes, there's going to be new bus lanes, better bus stops, but once again, they're on the major arterial routes in and out of the city, and people who live in villages, young people, elderly people, people who want to travel off-peak and so on, will get very limited benefit from these because they don't live where these major routes are. So, in a sense, I don't doubt for a moment the government wants to do something about this, and I'm sure that the Local Transport Act 2008 was well intended. My worry really, and my question on behalf of my constituents, is when will we see a difference on the ground? In other words, if the Minister says to me, well, in Bristol and South Gloucestershire, there's already cooperation with the bus companies, yeah, I know that. There's going to be new bus lanes, yeah, I know that. But most of this will not scratch where they itch my constituents who live in bits of the estate that aren't on the major route, people who live in villages. We had a public meeting in Iron Acton, the village that was actually going to be completely cut off by these changes. Elderly residents were saying they'd have to move out of the area because, for example, there's no GP in the village. So they couldn't get to their GP unless they ran community transport or whatever. But then people have appointments at the eye hospital early in the morning and they couldn't get in. And it was literally going to kill communities losing these services. And I don't see any evidence that anything beyond a radical shake-up is going to address these concerns. That, it just seems to me first are in it for what they can get out of it, and we should stop pretending otherwise. They make hefty profits, their bus services they run are profitable overall. They're not a charity. We've given them the chance to prove they have a public service ethos and they've kicked us in the teeth. So let's not pretend that relying on the goodwill of First or anybody else, frankly, is going to get us there. In my view, in our area, it may be different in other areas, but in our area, the answer is the local authorities of the area working together, franchising out a comprehensive network of services that will be stable for the long term, not cut at 8 weeks' notice, that will link in with the other public transport infrastructures, with the mainline railways and the suburban railways, that will provide off-peak services, rural services. I know, these things cost money, it's not an unlimited pot, but if First and others had to bid for that complete network, they'd have to take a choice. Are we going to be in Bristol or out? And it seems to me forcing the issue, and they want to be in the area, it's in their interest to stay in the area, we could get an awful lot more out of them than the relying on their goodwill that I fear essentially is the model we've relied on too much in the past. So, Mr Wiltshire, to draw these remarks together, I could have read out dozens more comments, angry people who want to be bus users, who want not to be in the car, and the number of people who wrote on the website, we're always being told to get out of the car and then they cut our bus service. There's profound frustration, and I hope that the Minister can tell us that the changes that the government has brought in, A, will actually be implemented very quickly, but B, will bring about a real change, not just on services, but on fares. And again, with young people, I've surveyed young people, and the cost of the fares was overwhelmingly their problem. But it just seems to me we've relied too much on the goodwill of the bus companies, which frankly they're not in the business of showing. Therefore, we've got to be much tougher on behalf of bus users than we have been so far. And I hope the Minister can assure us that the changes he's brought in will actually make a difference on the ground, because if not, I think further powers might be needed to make the bus companies provide a public service, which is what it should be all along.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Wiltshire, and may I congratulate at the outset the Honourable Member for North Avon on securing this debate on regulation of the bus services, and I do know that it is very close to his heart. Indeed, the honourable members referred Mr Wiltshire to a debate that he had some 18 months ago, particularly concentrating there, I believe, in terms of young people and their travel in particular. And my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Doncaster Central, of course, responded to that debate and was then indicating very clearly that we, as a Parliament, were working on improving the experience for bus users and bus users to come, because that very much is part of the strategy of government wanting to see a continual increase that we've now started to see in terms of bus patronage. We know, Mr Wiltshire, that bus services are the backbone of transport in this country for many, many people. Vast majority, some 5 billion journeys every single year are being undertaken. And indeed, we want to see more of that, and we want to see more quality bus services across the country rather than what, frankly, I believe is still a patchwork that exists across the country. But indeed, my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster Central, in responding some 18 months ago, was talking about the work that was going on in terms of developing the local transport bill, as it was then, and indeed recorded that there's some £2.5 billion that, as a government, is going into funding local bus services each and every year, including, of course, the £1 billion for the concessionary scheme for older and disabled people. Which, of course, has come into being since that last debate, and providing, indeed, opportunities for many of those people who may well be isolated by having a bus service for some 11 million older and disabled people. However, I recognise immediately the points that are made that you can have a gold-plated concessionary bus pass, but if you haven't got a bus, then you've got issues. And I will come, indeed, Mr Wiltshire, to the provisions where I believe that the Local Transport Act of 2008 actually does provide what I think the honourable member was referring to, the nothing short of a radical shake-up required of the bus service and the industry. I believe actually that the Local Transport Act provides the tools for that to happen, but it needs the leadership at all levels to take forward what is right for a given area. And I will come back to that very shortly in responding to some of the specifics that the honourable member referred to. Most certainly, as the honourable member recognises, that most bus services outside of London are, for the most, provided by commercial operators in a deregulated market. Any operator is free to run a local bus services. Indeed, Webb Enterprises could apply to run, having gained, obviously, an operator's licence, and register the routes and the timetables with the local traffic commissioner. And, of course, that is one right. It is equally within the rights of operators to withdraw bus services if they no longer makes commercial sense for them, and they are required to give a minimum notice of some 56 days to the traffic commissioner of any service cancellation. Local authorities do have the powers, and indeed what is happening here with the X27 service to which the honourable member refers, the local authority is able, of course, to subsidise socially necessary services that would otherwise not be provided through the commercial routes. And across the country, indeed, about 1/5 of all bus services are provided in exactly that way. However, I would readily accept that for the remainder, the vast majority, the 4/5 of services, that indeed it is true to say that historically there's been little scope for local authorities to be able to influence either the price or indeed the standard of service that's been offered. Indeed, it's invariably been left to the Adam Smith invisible hand, the working of the competition in the free market, so to say, to drive down fares and force up quality. Well, maybe I'll be generous, Mr Wiltshire, to say that after more than 2 decades of deregulation, then perhaps the fairest thing to say is that the results have been mixed. And I do believe, genuinely I do believe that there are, and I've indeed seen them as I've been around the country. I've seen some good examples and spoken to people that use those services as well, not just those that have briefed me, but where there are some good examples of partnership that have worked, that have brought together, if I say both sides of the table, but in a sense when it's a genuine partnership and where it works, of course you don't end up with being seen on both sides of the table because you're actually working hand in hand with supportive action with the local authority, with the local bus service providers. So indeed, places such as Telford, Brighton, York, Milton Keynes have seen increases in patronage where there has genuinely been that desire to go that extra mile, if I can use that term, to actually provide a service that is responsive and reflective. And these are increases in ridership over and above the average increase in England-wide concessionary fares. So make that clear that this is additional to that. But as I've indicated earlier on, my view is that there is far too much of a patchwork of average provision, poor provision, rather than the good ones that I could point to. And that's what we need to deal with, and that's what I believe that the Local Transport Act of 2008 does actually provide that. I have to say, I always, before I take a German debate, always like to make sure that I know what everyone's talking about. And indeed, when I looked at the focus on Sodbury, Yate and Doddington, I see that the Honourable Member does believe that we've only just tweaked the rules in the Local Transport Act. Well, hopefully I'll prove otherwise, Mr Wiltshire. And indeed, I know that he will be absolutely deliriously happy, because when I say to him about the greater powers that councils now will have and do have to determine what bus services operate in their area and to cap excessive fares, indeed which he's calling for apparently in this debate, I'm delighted to tell him that we are delivering that through that Local Transport Act. One of the principal aims of that Act is very much for local authorities to have a variety of options, to be able to exert greater influence over the standard of bus services in that deregulated market. And there is a strong emphasis in the Act on partnership working, because we certainly have seen where there are good examples, where there's strong partnership, then there has been an ability to be able to deliver and provide the ingredients for success to see an increase in patronage. The Honourable Member referred to previous attempts, Mr Wiltshire, to be able to get better bus services and the problems of, in a sense, looking as if companies are working hand in glove, issues about competition not working. Indeed, one of the problems that there was with previous legislation was that competition law worked actually as an obstacle to actually getting sensible partnerships. And that is why, under the Local Transport Act of last year, we've been able to work with the OFT to actually make sure that the provisions within the new Act make sure that there isn't that unnecessary obstacle, so that you can have a far stronger bus service and provision and negotiation through local authorities and the bus operators to make it a success. The Act... Well, I'll give way at that point.
I'm very grateful. As he mentions competition law, could he specifically address the question I asked at the start, which is, are First Bus correct to say that they couldn't have subsidised the X27 from the profits on another route? Is it as simple as that?
Certainly, let me answer that at this stage. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, it is not the case that companies cannot cross-subsidise between local routes. Indeed, if you think about a process of negotiations that might well happen, here is a package of routes that we want to see happen, says local transport authority, to bus company. They set it out as specification. Now, some of those undoubtedly will be more economically viable than others. So there would be a package, and one would assume, therefore, that any company that is bidding for that franchise, that operation, that route that wants to follow through, will actually see a process whereby they take into account the costs that are involved and the income streams that there would be. So I was interested in clearly the comments that the honourable member said that first had given us a reason for not being able to follow through the X27. But as my understanding is that there is no reason why they cannot cross-subsidise, unless, of course, it's an internal rule of their own. But let me say that in terms of the Act then, there are the quality partnership schemes, which, of course, the only successful one that really has flown was the one in North Sheffield, provided under the Transport Act of 2000. But one of the things that has been strengthened within the Local Transport Act, of course, are the provisions under the quality partnership schemes for the local transport authority to have the strength to be able to negotiate in terms of frequencies, in terms of timings, and in terms of maximum fares as part of the beefed up role that is there. So I think that that is important and helps to meet some of the concerns that he has, in fact, said in the conclusion. One of the issues about fares rising astronomically, well, one of the provisions of the new Act will cover that. Indeed, the Honourable Member, Mr Wiltshire, talks about his preference would be something along the lines of the quality contract schemes, as is the London style of franchising that happens. Now, that may be a realistic option for given areas. But again, it is for local authorities and local transport authorities to make a decision as to what would meet their requirements. Indeed, we have changed the rules because, again, I think the Honourable Member referred to the level of the level of the hurdles that had to be crossed were so high that it made it unrealistic. Well, we indeed took the opportunity to look at that provision in the Local Transport Act, and indeed the current requirement was that it was only practical way of achieving a local authority's objectives. Well, we've now set it with a much more balanced position of the public interest criteria that these schemes would meet, which makes it far more realistic in terms of being able to meet those requirements under a quality contract scheme. Let me say, in terms of the timetable for quality contract schemes, one of the things I said once we'd got the Act through and on the statute book at the end of November last year, we now need to get on with rolling out the provisions, because as honourable members here and right honourable members will know, Mr Wiltshire, we can pass the legislation, but you need to be able to roll it out and get it going. And indeed, that's what we've been doing in a whole range of other areas. There are a lot of work to be done, including, might I just put on record, setting up passenger focus to have now a strong voice for the travelling public on the buses as well as the railways. So that's been another provision that came into being at the earlier in April. But in terms of quality contracts, we will be shortly consulting on the requirement secondary legislation, and I would hope to see the quality contracts provision up and running by indeed the end of this year, 2009, because I very much like the Honourable Member want to see this Act a reality on the ground, making a difference for those people that he represents here today, and indeed we represent across the country. So again, I hope to see that being a way forward. Let me say, it is the Local Transport Act, I do believe, can provide that radical change that is required, but it needs the leadership at a local level. And I say that's not only from elected leaders, but of course that's fundamentally important, but also from officers and those working in the industry and those in local bus companies. We all want one thing: more people on the buses using those reliably, efficiently and effectively. I want to see that happen, but it needs, as they say, it takes two to tango. It certainly needs to happen here. And I have to say, when I was in Bristol recently, I met with the West of England Partnership. And I hope if there's one thing that comes out of this, is that the Honourable Member for North Avon and colleagues alike work with the leaders and the leadership of the West England Partnership to see what can really be taken forward out of the Local Transport Act to make a real difference for the travelling public, whether it's in South Gloucestershire, Bristol and the rest of the area.
Order.